And if you're interested in that, it's on YouTube, so please listen to that. And last night we also had Professor Whitla, David Whitla, speak of why Reformed Presbyterians sing the Psalms. That's another interesting presentation for you. Well, it is my privilege to welcome David this morning again, a fellow Irishman. And at least the Bloomington congregation will understand, David, because you've been listening to me the last 3 years. Although Ireland is an island of 32 counties, but maybe 32,000 different accents. So you may notice a slight difference in David's accent because he lived 30 minutes down the road from where I lived in Ireland. David is professor of church history at the Reformed Presbyterian Seminary in Pittsburgh. And this morning he's coming to speak on the history of the Reformed Presbyterians, of the Covenanters. And so I hope you enjoy this lecture. After the lecture, there will be a time for questions and answers. So please keep your questions till the end, and you'll be able to ask David some of those questions. And then after that, there'll be refreshments before our next speaker, the Reverend James Ferris, who'll be speaking about the Reverend James Ferris, but not about himself. So at this time, I invite David to please come forward. Thank you, David.
And thank you to Philip for that introduction. It's good to know there's at least one other person in the room with no accent of any description whatsoever. And I also am really delighted that you all now know I was talking about the Psalms and not the Psalms. People here know how Irish people use that word, and I wondered if I would need a disclaimer. But then, of course, I remembered that this is how you say it as well. So, well, it is indeed a pleasure to be here with you this morning to talk a little bit about the history of the Covenanters. That is still a nickname, perhaps, that Reformed Presbyterians like to go by. This is our heritage, and I want to share a little bit about that with you here today. As Philip said, I do teach church history at the Reformed Presbyterian Seminary in Pittsburgh, and I love my job because I get to tell stories all day. And at the end of the day, that's what history is. It's a story, and it always class on the first day of the term. Places like, oh no, it's history class. And usually when I push a little bit, I find that somewhere in their past they had a history teacher that just made history really boring to them. Well, I hope that I will not continue that terrible aspersion that is cast upon history teachers this morning. And I want to remind us all that history is just a story. And to sound cliched, it is his story. Okay, we believe that the story has a storyteller, and the storyteller is God. Church history is the story of Jesus Christ building his church. And within the great encyclopedia of church history, there are also many tribal histories, as I like to call them, stories of small often ethnic churches which have been preserved by the grace of God for many generations. And such is the Reformed Presbyterian family of churches. We're kidding ourselves this morning if we think that ours is the only story worth telling. It's always tempting for anybody in their tribe to perhaps blow out of proportion our little story to the rest of the great meta-narrative of what Christ is doing, building his church throughout the world. We are, if I can quote the biblical phrase, small among the tribes of Israel. But we have an amazing story, a truly amazing story. It's a story of heroes and heretics. It's a story of martyrs and missionaries, a story of extraordinary theologians and very ordinary men and women and boys and girls who sang the Psalms for many centuries. But above all, it's a story of God's faithfulness to that promise that Jesus made in Matthew 16:18. I will build my church. So what I want to do in the next hour is to give a broad overview of the history of Reformed Presbyterians, or Covenanters as we are often called. Going back to our roots in the Scottish Reformation, some 500 years ago, right up to the present day here in America. Now, that is a story that spans some 500 years, and I've been given a little under an hour. Okay, so we will do our best, and with this big picture background then, as you've heard, James Ferris is going to come forward and zero in a little more on the local history here in Bloomington through his forefather. So our Presbyterian story, like any good traditional Presbyterian sermon, has 3 points to it. At least that's how I've decided to break this up this morning. 3 steps, we might say, in the story. And they all begin with the same letter as well, like very traditional Presbyterian sermons. So bear with me as we go through the story of triumph, tragedy, and transition. 3 T's, hopefully you'll remember. Triumph, tragedy, and transition. We begin with triumph, and I'm an optimist. We're going to spend most of our time on the triumph section here this morning. The story of the Scottish Reformation begins somewhat later than the other Reformations in early modern Europe. But although the light of the Reformation arrived there somewhat later, it would also arguably shine there the brightest and the longest. We begin our story at the end of the Middle Ages in Scotland. And Scotland is a nation in need of reform. The medieval church in Scotland was notoriously corrupt, with much popular satire directed against its profligate and often illiterate clergy. The church wielded great economic power over a very weak executive of king and many squabbling nobles. The church possessed almost half the nation's wealth and wielded, of course, an even greater spiritual power over the people through its sacraments. Now, Scotland had always been a poor nation, right on the very edge of Europe. And by the mid-1500s, she'd become a political satellite of Catholic France. However, these ties with continental Europe came with a great advantage. It meant that there was a constant stream of Scottish students going to and from the great university cities like Paris and Wittenberg. Now, you may not know a lot about Reformation history, but perhaps the name Wittenberg rings a bell, because there was a particularly controversial new professor that emerged in Wittenberg in the early 1500s by the name of Martin Luther. And Luther began to influence these Scottish students that were going to the continent. And one of them was this man, Patrick Hamilton. Hamilton was a young priest who came under the power of the gospel by reading Tyndale's English Bible and all this banned Lutheran literature. And so he decided he really needed to go to Wittenberg to study under the great Dr. Luther, and that's what he did. And Luther and Hamilton became firm friends. When Hamilton came back to Scotland, he knew what he needed to do. He needed to bring the light of the gospel to his fellow Scotsmen. And when he came back, he preached what we call the 5 solas of the Reformation: sola scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia, solus Christus, and soli Deo gloria. Now, you don't have to be brilliant at Latin to know what these are saying. Scripture alone is our authority. By faith alone, we are saved. By grace alone, we are saved, and not by works. Christ alone saves, and we live our Christian lives for the glory of God alone. Friends, this is a really important place to really start our lecture today, because if you forget everything else I'm going to say in this hour about our identity as RPs, remember this. This is the meaning of the R in RP. What does it mean to be a Reformed Presbyterian? Maybe that's happened to you. Maybe you're on a plane and you get talking and, Reformed Presbyterian. Well, what kind of a Presbyterian is a Reformed Presbyterian? 5 solas. You've got the gospel right there, okay? It's a great way to bring people to the heart of what we believe, that we believe in the power of the gospel of grace. Well, Patrick Hamilton really was the first great preacher of these doctrines in Scotland, and the authorities didn't like him for it. He was soon accused of heresy, put on trial, and condemned to death. And he was slowly roasted alive at St. Andrews in 1528, the first Scottish martyr of the Reformation. But he became a hero to the Scottish people overnight. In fact, Cardinal Beaton, who had ordered his execution, woefully said afterwards that the reek of Master Patrick Hamilton has infected as many as it blew upon. The smell of burning martyr filled the nostrils of the Scottish people, and they determined that they needed change. And so this infection spread quickly. Increasing numbers of Scottish commoners and nobles began to embrace the new faith. Well, when the Scottish King James V died, he left a 6-year-old successor, little Mary, who was to be the future Mary, Queen of Scots. She was shuffled off to the French Catholic court to be raised, and in the meantime, there was a power vacuum. And the Protestant nobles took advantage of this to begin to see the gospel preached within the nation. And the Lord raised up many important people, the most important of which you'll all have heard of, John Knox. John Knox's name really has become virtually synonymous with the Scottish Reformation. And his statue stands tall in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh to this day. Knox is a marvelously complex person. He's one of the most universally praised and vilified characters in the whole history of the church. But when James's widow, Mary de Guise, became the regent of Scotland until her daughter, Princess Mary, came of age, Knox was banished from Scotland, as were so many preachers. And for 12 years, he served in many different capacities, but most famously, he took himself to Calvin's Geneva, where he pastored a congregation of English expats. Now, we know that God tends to ready his man for the hour, and that is certainly the case with John Knox in Geneva. These were extremely formative years for this young man. Not only was he gaining pastoral experience, but he also tasted and practiced a pure biblical doctrine of the word and sacraments and church discipline than anything his homeland had ever experienced. And this is what we call Presbyterianism. This is the P part of RP, if you will. Knox wrote to his friends back home that in Geneva he had found a perfect school of the prophets, and he longed to return to his native Scotland to see the church there reformed along these Presbyterian lines. Meanwhile, back home, while Knox was learning all this, those Protestant Scottish nobles were continuing to flex their muscles, and they banded themselves together in a covenant in 1557, styling themselves the Lords of the Congregation. Now, if that sounds pretentious, Lord was just a name given to the nobles. They were lairds, okay, or lords. What kind of Scottish lairds are we? We are the lairds of the congregation. And the idea was that they would establish the Lord's congregation in Scotland if it was the last thing they did. And they vowed together in this covenant, quote, to set forward the blessed word of God and his congregation in Scotland. So right from the start of our story, the Scottish Reformation was a covenanted Reformation. That is to say, it came to pass through the idea of a covenant, binding ourselves together to one another to see the church reformed, but more importantly, binding ourselves to Christ, the Lord of the covenant himself, so that his church would be built. Well, the lords of the congregation knew the man they needed. They needed Knox, and they summoned him back in 1559. And with military help from their Protestant neighbor, Queen Elizabeth I of England, they marched on Edinburgh and they deposed the French regent, Mary de Guise. And they went ahead to establish the Reformation. And so if the traditional year of Reformation in continental Europe is 1517, with the nailing of the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, then the traditional year of the Reformation in Scotland is the year 1560, the year of the great Reformation Parliament. The Reformation Parliament set to work establishing a national church that would be marked by two things. Let me help you remember them. R and P, okay? This national church would be reformed. And the Reformed theology of the church, those 5 solas of the Reformation, were enshrined in this document, the Confession of the Scottish People, the Scots Confession of 1560. And then, of course, there's the P part. The Presbyterian government and worship of the church were enshrined in 2 other documents, the Book of Discipline and the Book of Common Order. And so for everyday Scottish people, going to church began to look very different. Instead of the cycle of Catholic festivals, there was instead a weekly Christian Sabbath. And their diet of the word was supplemented by family worship, a new love of metrical psalmody that we were talking about last night, and regular catechesis. Instead of illiterate priests, pastoral oversight was managed by a plurality of ruling elders in the local church, with teaching elders to preach the word of God. And schools were established in every parish, so that before long, within a few generations, Scotland built one of the most literate and particularly the most theologically literate society in early modern Europe. Now, perhaps you look at the screen and you say, well, hang on a minute, I'm seeing 2 words here that don't seem to fit. You're talking about a church, but you've also got the word parliament up there. And so we need to raise a question that's really important to us as covenanters, and it's this question of the relationship between the church and the state. And I think particularly here, as we're in America, to be careful here, but we're in America, and we perhaps think a little differently about this than 16th century Scots did. There are certain early modern assumptions about the relationship of church and state that we need to get clear. Our forefathers in the 16th century had inherited this idea of Christendom. And the way it works is this. All Scotsmen were born into a Christian nation. They were subjects of a Christian king. And that Christian king governed the temporal affairs of the kingdom through his representatives of the people, known as the Parliament, or the lesser magistrate is the term they use. But in addition to this, all Scotsmen were baptized after they were born into one national established Church of Scotland. And you may know it by its Scottish term, the Kirk. All right? The Kirk is simply the Scots word for church. One national church where Christ governed all ecclesiastical affairs in the kingdom as the king. He did so through his courts, from the local session up through the regional presbyteries and synods to the General Assembly. And these 2 kingdoms, as they were known, the kingdom of church and the kingdom of state, were expected to partner together to ensure that the church was spiritually independent, to govern herself, and to establish biblical doctrine, worship, and discipline in that nation. This was the idea of Christendom, a partnership between church and state. However, that may have looked good on paper, but it was very hard to put into practice. And so, as we're going to see, what we got instead in subsequent centuries was not a partnership between church and state, but a competition for control of the church. And the great question became, who is the head of the church? Is it Jesus Christ, or is it the earthly monarch? And so we see in the subsequent centuries several roadblocks being thrown up to Reformation. Any such movement of the Spirit of God can expect opposition. And certainly we see ferocious opposition, many enemies lined up to stand in the way, and almost all of them came from the direction of the civil magistrate. I'll just give you a few highlights of these attempts to control the church. There's Mary, Queen of Scots, okay? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on her because we're in mixed company and it wouldn't be polite. Her life reads like a soap opera, okay? It's the reason why she is Hollywood's favorite, probably English queen, and probably most that you've heard about her is true. But she did come back when she came of age from France to claim her throne in 1560. That's right, same year as the Reformation. And she wasn't having it. She wasn't having it. And for 7 years, she wrestled with the Scottish nobles and Parliament, and ultimately, through a series of political intrigues and personal scandals that I won't mention, she was forced to abdicate, and her son came to power. Now, I say her son came to power. He was 1 year old. This was the future James VI. So James VI of Scotland, in 1603, he also became the King James I of England. That's why he has this funny title, James VI/1st. He's the 6th James of Scotland, and he's the 1st James of England. But when he came of age and took his throne of both these kingdoms, it wasn't long before he started imposing his will on the church. And so King James, of King James Version fame, was a theologian in his own right, and he wrote many theological works in which he developed this idea of the divine right of kings. And this idea was that it's not Christ who ultimately is head of the church in the nation, but the head of state. So the king of the nation is also the guy who decides how we worship Christ in the church. If you want a technical term for that, it's Erastianism, after Thomas Erastus, a Swiss theologian. So this divine right of kings doctrine, he began to put into practice. And the way he did it was, he said, let's start putting bishops into the presbyteries. James's motto was no bishop, no king. In other words, if there are no hierarchical bishops, then the king will have no practical say whatsoever in how the church is run. So basically, he puts his yes men into the courts of the church to make sure he has his will done. So some elders, we might say, are more equal than others. That's basically the idea of it. And the King James, if he wants his way, he'll say, okay, bishops, this is what I want. Go to presbytery and get the vote, please. That's exactly what he did. One of the most notorious examples in which he tried to impose his will on worship was he stacked the General Assembly of Perth in 1618 with his bishops, and he got a vote to pass changes to worship. The most notorious of the 5 articles of Perth that came out said that when Presbyterians came to worship, they had to kneel down at the communion table to receive the Lord's Supper. And of course, Scottish people said that this is just a throwback to the Middle Ages. You're basically telling us to kneel down before the bread and the wine, as though it were being transubstantiated. This is a return to the Mass. There's many other things I could share about King James and what he tried to do to the church. Suffice to say that by the end of his reign, the Scottish Presbyterian Church had been so infiltrated that it was in desperate need of a second Reformation. A second Reformation. But before we move on to talk about that, let me just mention one more king. Here's Charles I. And you be careful because we're probably going to get a Charles III before long. We've never had a good King Charles. Let me just say that, at least from our perspective as RPs, okay? Charles I took this divine right of kings doctrine to the next level. And basically, he ruled as a tyrant without any reference to his parliament for 11 years. And he began to impose his will on the church in England and in Scotland. Most notoriously, he introduced the Book of Common Prayer into the Scottish Presbyterian Church in 1637. And this was basically a liturgy, a written liturgy that resembled the Roman Catholic Mass. The communion table was now to be called the altar. The Bible readings would now include readings from the Apocrypha. The priest would consecrate the elements with his back turned to the congregation to show reverence for the bread and the wine. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. What we have, you see, is a king, an earthly king, acting like he's the head of the church. But Christ alone has the authority to decide how God is worshipped. He regulates the worship, as we thought last night. And here's Charles riding roughshod over the consciences of his Scottish people. Well, this led to the Scottish Second Reformation. And there's lots of iconic days from our church history we could talk about here. I think everybody's favorite is illustrated in this 17th century engraving. This is what happens when a bishop gets up in an RP church and tries to read something that sounds like a Catholic Mass. Now, I'm not suggesting this is a model for us to follow. It's good that the pews you're sitting in here are attached to the ground. They weren't, generally speaking, in the early modern period. People would bring their own stools and sit on them for church. But there was a riot in St. Giles Cathedral when the prayer book was read for the first time. And there's a very famous, maybe legendary story of Jenny Geddes, who picked up her stool and hurled it at the guy in the pulpit and said, "Foul fiend, dost thou say mass in a lug?" You need a translation for that one, probably. Basically, what's this mass that you're reading in church? And there was a riot, and riots in many churches, actually, that showed that the people were not going to let the king decide how they should worship God. Well, in response to all of this, the protesters did the same thing they had done back in 1557. They wrote a covenant, and it was the Scottish National Covenant of 1638, a public covenant between the nation and Christ, that they free the church from government control and defend the true Reformed religion and reject the recent innovations in worship that the king had decreed. And effectively, they were doing the same thing as what the Old Testament people of God had done in covenanting with him. They saw a biblical precedent. And historically, this is really what defines us as covenanters. Historian J.D. Douglas, I think, summarizes it very well. An assertion by the Kirk of freedom from royal or state control, a personal oath of allegiance to Jesus Christ, the only head of the church, the King of Kings, and a dedication of life to him. What does it mean to be RP? That's what it means to be RP. We have a living relationship with Jesus Christ. We have dedicated our lives to him. And that is therefore going to bind our consciences to a particular position on the relationship of church and state. That the church is independent to serve Christ according to his will and not that of the civil magistrate. And as you're probably aware, this idea of social public covenanting remains one of the distinctive principles of the RP Church today. Although, admittedly, we might say it's something of a nuclear option for the church in times of particular persecution and danger, but one that has proven unifying, something that we have had to resort to particularly frequently. But this is the national covenant, and those who signed it came to be known as Covenanters. Well, this covenant was quickly followed by the Great Glasgow General Assembly of 1638, really perhaps the most far-reaching assembly in our entire history. In defiance of the king, the elders and ministers came together and they rejected the king's bishops. They excommunicated them from the church. The Articles of Perth and the Prayer Book were condemned, and a second Reformation was codified for the Scottish Church, deposing Charles from Christ's throne in the Church of Scotland. And this really is the high point in the triumph section of our story. A second Reformation and a nation transformed. Well, let me briskly run through a very complicated but fascinating decade of the British Civil Wars. As you can imagine, King Charles wasn't too happy with what his northern kingdom had been getting up to. And soon he was at war with Scotland. Number two wars called the Bishops' Wars, rather aptly named. And this is where the blue banner was first raised on the battlefield for Christ's crown and covenant. And really, Charles had no option but to recall the English Parliament to raise an army to fight his RPs up in Scotland. And yes, this is the same Parliament he'd been ignoring for 11 years. And that Parliament had a few scores to settle themselves. It wasn't long before the king was actually at war with his own English Parliament, a civil war, and in need of military help. The English Parliament came to Scotland and said, "Would you enter into a covenant with us to help us bring our king to terms?" And our forefathers said, "That sounds like a good plan, but here's what we would like as well." And the negotiations that ensued, a second covenant was entered into, not just for the nation of Scotland, but for the three kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. It was the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643. It was a solemn political league. Thousands of Covenanter troops were committed to help the English Parliament bring Charles to terms, and it was a solemn religious covenant. By this covenant, the English Parliament promised that the reformation of the church in England would be along Scottish lines. Essentially, the vision was to have one national RP church in the three British kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Just let that sink in for a moment. Did you hear me? One national RP church in Britain. That's an amazing thing to aspire to. And this new national church, of course, would need its own confession of faith. It would need its own catechisms, its own psalter to sing praises, its own book of discipline. And the task to produce these documents fell to the Westminster Assembly of Divines. You see in the background here, 1643 to 49, this is where the RP Church gets its subordinate standards. The Westminster Confession and catechisms remain to this day our subordinate standards. Now, unfortunately, this vision of national British RP churches didn't quite come to pass. I think you knew that, okay? And we begin the slide to chapter 2, to the tragedy section of our story. The Covenanter army did come south. They fought valiantly, but they were increasingly sidelined by this gentleman here, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell, a brilliant, he was an English Puritan, a brilliant military general. His new model army defeated Charles, and to the shock of Europe, they beheaded Charles I for treason against his own people. And without going into too much detail, it led to great divisions in the Covenanter ranks. In the wake of the king's execution, they weren't sure how to respond. Some of the Covenanters decided to immediately crown King Charles' son as Charles II. I'm just going to say it. That was a bad move. That was a bad move. Charles II was living basically the life of a playboy in the French court. He was a wicked man. They knew it, but they compelled him to sign the Solemn League and Covenant and then crowned him. And then they said, this is the way we're going to get our national RP church. Sad to say, it was naive. Cromwell swiftly invaded, defeated 2 Scottish armies. Charles II fled back to his debauched life on the continent to fight another day. And Scotland and the RP Church of Scotland came under an English occupation for the rest of the 1650s. Now, this is not an unhappy episode in our history, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge that our what we see now is the decline into the tragedy chapter. And, you know, the tragedy chapter of our story is really the shortest section of our story, 1660 to 1688. If you're keeping track, we've gone through centuries already. But this little portion of our story is probably the portion that we are best known for. The persecution of our forefathers during the reigns of Charles II and James II. And a lot of this story has passed into legend. The Scottish Covenanters are etched on the memories of Scottish people even to this day. And their lonely memorials dot the landscape of the Scottish lowlands, and their heroic stories of their martyrdoms form much Victorian-era artwork and ballads and novels. So how did this tragedy happen? Well, Charles II did come back from France, and he was crowned, this time by all the 3 kingdoms in 1660. On his 30th birthday, May 29th, 1660, the restoration of Charles II as king. And what he said he would do is that he would respect the tender consciences of his Scottish subjects. He even sent a personal letter to the Presbytery of Edinburgh saying that he would preserve the government of the Church of Scotland. But it was all talk. It was all a subterfuge to get his throne back. And soon as he had found his power established, he began to dismantle the Scottish Presbyterian Church and to reestablish full hierarchical episcopacy in its place, government by bishops. 1661, the Scottish Parliament, known as the Drunken Parliament, I'll let you figure out why, they declared Charles II to be head of the national church as well as state. And a flurry of legislation was issued forth, calculated to isolate the Covenanters, repealing all former laws that had established Reformed Presbyterianism. And even the covenants were declared by Parliament to be treasonable documents and burned by the public hangman. 1662, all meetings of sessions, presbyteries, and synods were outlawed. Bishops were restored into the Church of Scotland, and all pastors who refused to accept their authority were ejected from their churches and replaced by government-appointed clergy known as the King's Curates. And in 1663, Charles rounded up and executed key Covenanter leaders. Some, like James Guthrie and Archibald Johnson of Warriston, were hanged. Others, like Samuel Rutherford, died before they could stand trial. Many others fled into exile. Now, in the face of these kinds of pressures, about 2/3 of the Scottish clergy submitted. But the third that remained were nonconformists now, outside the newly established and reformed Church of Scotland. And the rest of the Covenanter story for this period of tragedy is one of calculated civil disobedience. It's the time of the church in the wilderness, the time of the conventicles. Conventicles were secret church meetings. They couldn't worship publicly in their church buildings anymore. The church buildings were now being occupied. And so they were forced out into the fields to sing the psalms out in the lonely mountains and valleys, free from disturbance. Of course, legislation was soon enacted to try and shut these conventicles down. There was, for example, the Bishop's Dragnet Act of 1665. You're not going to come to church and listen to the king's preacher. We're going to start taking the attendance roll. And if you're not there, we're going to fine you half of your annual wages. And we're going to force you to swear a new covenant, a new oath, the abjuration oath. The abjuration oath was a devilish device which abjured the covenants and declared that the king was sovereign over the church. And then, of course, this led to uproar. The Pentland Rising of 1666 was really an effort by Covenanters to march to the Scottish Parliament and present a petition. Please let this stop. Of course, it was translated by the authorities as a rebellion, and there was a battle in which many Covenanters were killed. Prisoners were tortured, hanged in their hometowns as a warning, or deported as slaves to the New World. Well, as a result of this, there was a new attempt made to try to reconcile the Covenanters through a series of acts known as the Indulgences. This is basically a new tactic by King Charles to enforce conformity. Let's offer nonconformist ministers that they can come back to their churches if they will acknowledge the king's supremacy. But of course, they couldn't do it. And those that remained stubbornly committed to the covenants and that vision that the covenants presented came to be known as the Cameronians, named for Richard Cameron and the other famous preacher, Donald Cargill. In fact, it occurred to me that both of this morning's speakers have named their sons after Richard Cameron. It's a common name for Covenanters to give to their children. It's a good name. But these were martyrs who gave their all to stand firm for Christ's crown and covenant. Now, the government made several attempts, an active state-sponsored terrorism. Militias of Catholic Highland mercenaries came down to plunder the Covenanter stronghold of southwest Scotland. 8 weeks of plunder, rape, torture, and murder ensued. They billeted themselves in family homes and farms and were indemnified of any damages by the government. The result was increasing outspokenness and desperation among our forefathers' ranks. Lots of events really illustrate this rising tension. One of the most notorious is the assassination of Archbishop Sharp, who was the religious head of the Church of Scotland. Sharp had actually been a former Covenanter. He had betrayed the cause and was foremost among the efforts to put an end to the Covenanter risings. He was ambushed and assassinated by a band of armed Covenanters in what most interpreted as a revenge killing. And this led to a downward spiral of more battles between Covenanters and government forces. 2 battles, particularly Drumclog and Bothwell Bridge, really ended in decisive routs for the king and his men, and the remaining remnant became hunted men. And yet, one of the most remarkable features of the underground RP Church in this chapter of tragedy is that in the midst of such persecution and suffering, it had the ability to still make very public testimonies against the tyranny of the king. And these testimonies served as a rallying point for the remnant on the run. Perhaps the best known of these is the Sanquhar Declaration of 1680, penned by Richard Cameron, which advocated armed rebellion against tyranny and declaring that Jesus Christ is king and head of the church. A lot of people look at that today and they say, well, that was a bit of a futile gesture, wasn't it? Here are these small bands of Presbyterians running for their lives. They're Scotland's most wanted, and here they are declaring that Christ is king and tyranny will be overthrown. Well, that may sound like a bunch of bold, defiant loudmouths hiding in the hills, but let me tell you something. That was actually prophetic. Because shortly afterwards, the Stuart kings would be overthrown by an armed rebellion. And the 3 kingdoms would actually come to see things the Covenanters' way, perhaps not with respect to the church, but certainly with respect to the tyranny of the civil magistrate. And so when you get to the accession of James II in 1685, we see the tide begin to turn against these tyrants. James II was the brother of Charles. It's not that Charles didn't have any children. He had a lot of children. They just weren't legitimate heirs. I'll just leave it at that. But James II was Roman Catholic. And he became James II of England, which of course makes him James VII now of Scotland. And he offered an indulgence as well, but to his Catholic subjects. And people across Britain began to be afraid that perhaps they would see a return to Catholic persecution as they had experienced during the First Reformation. He began to crack down on Covenanters as well. He basically engaged in a policy of extermination. And Scotland saw a huge rise in martyrdoms in a period that came to be known as the Killing Time. And this is where we have many famous martyrs. We've got the Wigtown martyrs, the two Margarets tied to stakes in the Solway Firth. The younger Margaret forced to watch the drowning of the elder Margaret in an effort to make her recant her faith. And she refused, and they both perished in the waters. Or John Brown of Priest Hill, who was shot in front of his wife and children at his farm in Priest Hill. James Renwick, the last Covenanter minister, publicly hanged in the Grassmarket of Edinburgh in 1688, and many, many more that you perhaps can tell of as well. You might ask the question, how do you function as an illegal Presbyterian church in such circumstances? And how do you do that when all of your ministers have been either imprisoned or exiled or judicially murdered for treason? Viable church life for Reformed Presbyterians was interrupted for decades. And as conventicles were becoming increasingly dangerous, a new approach was taken by our forefathers. They formed themselves into societies. They came to be known as the United Societies. And they were regional secret meetings of Covenanters for fellowship and Bible study and prayer. The society meetings, as they came to be known, and the society people is how they came to be known in Scotland. And these society meetings were the seeds of the present Reformed Presbyterian churches. These meetings provided a means for the remnant to discuss how best to respond to the persecution, both biblically and practically. And certainly one of the greatest legacies that they have bequeathed to us was formulating a doctrine that all Reformed Presbyterians hold dear, and that is the mediatorial kingship of Christ, not only over the church, but also over the state as well. You see, it was in the crucible of persecution that our forefathers developed our distinctive doctrine that Christ, in his office of mediator, is not only sovereign over the church, but also over the civil arena as well. That every realm should bow to Christ, including the civil magistrate. That loyalty to Christ comes before loyalty to the king, and that resistance to a tyrant is therefore justified. And as I've said, this was soon a position shared by more than just the Covenanters with the glorious revolution of 1688, by which James II was driven from his throne by his Dutch son-in-law, who came to be William III, and the persecution finally came to an end. Well, we thought about triumph and tragedy, and that brings us to our third chapter briefly, and that's transition. Transition, going from Covenanters in Scotland to Covenanters here in America. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I do want to clarify that we're not simply talking about a geographic transition from the old world to the new world. In a very real sense, we're talking about a transition from Covenanters to Reformed Presbyterians. What's the difference, you say? Well, over the course of several centuries, we have found that we have, as a denomination, made an impact upon this nation. And this nation has also made an impact upon us. And I don't say that in any negative way. Many of the convictions that our forefathers held dear, we have, of course, held on to. Many others have been shaped through the process of time and new challenges that Covenanters face coming to a new socio-political context. The Revolution settlement of 1690 was where basically the King William came in and he decided that Scotland could remain Presbyterian. That, we think, sounds great. But our Covenanting forefathers in Scotland were not content because the covenants remained legally annulled. And for the surviving society people, they were perpetually binding upon all those who had signed them and their descendants. And so they swore the covenants publicly in Scotland even after the Revolution, and remained a non-conforming body until joined by various ordained ministers. They formed the RP Church of Scotland. They began as a presbytery in 1743 and a synod in 1811. And the Scottish RP Church produced some of its most important missionaries and theologians. Many of you will have heard of John G. Peyton, the missionary to the New Hebrides, the cannibal tribes there, and also William Symington, the great theologian who gave us a definitive work on the mediatorial kingship. And then, of course, there's the Irish RP Church. The centuries that followed the Revolution also saw much emigration from Scotland to Ireland. And these Scots-Irish Covenanters formed the RP Church of Ireland. That was a presbytery in 1763, and then also a synod in 1811. Now, I need to just set the record straight here, and Philip will appreciate this, that actually most RPs in America originally did not come from Scotland at all. They actually came from Ireland, right? They were Scots-Irish, so we might say they were Irishmen with Scottish accents, okay? But most of the immigration, most of the Covenanter immigrants actually came from Ireland. We could say they came from Scotland through Ireland, just to make sure I don't get in trouble with my Scottish friends here. But today, the Irish RP Church and the Scottish RP Church are, of course, still in existence. But what about the RPCNA? Well, there were waves of immigration to America for religious reasons. Certainly, the Church of Ireland continued to be Episcopalian. That put pressure on Irish RPs. There were economic reasons. America, of course, was a land of opportunity. And there were also political reasons as well. Many of the first RPs to come here came here because they were on the run from the hangman. Ireland is a country of many rebellions. And the Irish Rebellion in 1790, many Covenanters fought against the tyranny of the king there as well, and were forced to come here for refuge. Most of the society people that came were lay people, most settled in Pennsylvania, in New York, and South Carolina. The first Covenanter pastor here was Alexander Craighead. He preached during the Great Awakening with George Whitefield, and he gained a reputation as an outspoken critic of the mainline Presbyterian Church, subscribing to Old World Scottish covenants in a New World context. But that was a position that began to be questioned. To what sense should we continue to hold to the covenants of Scotland in North America? I'll come back to that in a moment. The Reformed Presbytery was formed in 1774 as more ministers came from Ireland, and shortly afterwards, as you know, the states were at war. The Revolutionary War, Covenanters fought as patriots against a covenant-breaking British king. Here we go again, right? Seeing a pattern here. This was something that our forefathers here were very happy to do. And during this conflict, as British rule was thrown off, many Covenanters asked an important question. Do the Scottish covenants still bind the United States of America? And the Reformed Presbytery decided that they were now essentially obsolete in this new nation that had just been born, but they continued, and I quote, to hold the covenants, testimonies, and sufferings of those in Scotland in respectful remembrance. And in taking this action, this small fledgling presbytery took its first steps in transition from Covenanters to American Reformed Presbyterians by acknowledging that the Scottish covenants would have to be reinterpreted and reapplied in this New World context. Well, in 1798, the RPCNA was formed after a brief attempt to merge with the Seceder Church. And if you notice that date, 1798, something kind of important happened in American history in 1798. Okay, I hope you know what that is. That's right. The U.S. Constitution came into being, and the Reformed Presbyterian Church was bitterly disappointed. With the terms of this document. It raised two major issues that really dominated ever since. And I'm sure James will address some of these in the next lecture. The first, of course, is the abolition of slavery. How, the Reformed Presbyterian Church asked, how could the church condone a constitution that allowed for slavery? This was a serious issue. How could this claim to be a Christian nation? Our forefathers asked. The RPCNA became the first Protestant denomination in America, really, to pursue abolition, and did so vigorously. In a time when many Presbyterian ministers owned slaves, RP ministers were furiously writing essays against this great sin. And the RPCNA took the unprecedented step of excommunicating slaveholders and worshiping alongside their black neighbors, many being driven from the southern states for doing so. And I'm sure James will have more to say about that. It's important to point out that the RPCNA became increasingly influenced by the rise of evangelicalism, throwing ourselves, as so many other denominations did, into voluntary societies for abolition and a host of other Christian causes in the public square. RPs argued that if America was not constitutionally a Christian nation, let's at least work to see America Christianized and brought under the rule of King Jesus. And then the second issue, very briefly, was the Constitution itself. The way our forefathers saw it was that the United States had rebelled against a Christian kingdom, but it had established a secular republic. So while we, the people, may have been majority Christian at the time, that did not make America a Christian nation. And Covenanters defined a nation not by its resident and cultures, but rather by its state laws. There was no pledging of America to be a Christian nation as Scotland had done in the previous centuries, and this was considered to be a fatal flaw. And thus, we took a position of principled political dissent for a number of centuries. Separation of church and state, absolute. There was to be a partnership between them. Many important theologians, Alexander MacLeod, who you see here, Samuel B. Wiley, James R. Wilson, wrote extensively on this matter. But as we come to a close here, the other great influence that we see upon our denomination, as affected other denominations, is this principle of democratization. How did we go from comparative isolation to engagement? In the 19th and 20th centuries, we see Covenanters moving from complete political dissent and isolation to increased engagement with the political system and other denominations as we do today. And examples abound. I'll just mention the Christian Amendment movement, an effort to try to ensure that the United States Constitution would include a reference to Christ as the King, but of course that remains, must not remain there today either. This is something that we would long to see, our nation acknowledging the kingship of Christ. Many of these new applications of historical theological concerns came together in the 1871 Covenant, and you'll notice that date this year marks the 250th anniversary of this covenant. And our denomination basically retained its Scottish Covenanter heritage while acknowledging that the mediatorial kingship of Christ transcends time and place and must be brought to bear upon each generation. Well, let me just close with this. The story of our denomination since then, as with so many Reformed denominations, has been one of decline and recovery. Numbers declined in the 20th century through an end of Scots-Irish immigration, of splits as well. But in the close of the century, things began to turn around again with a fresh zeal for youth ministry, a fresh zeal for domestic evangelism, and multiple foreign mission works around the world, to the point where now in this day we are climbing beyond our pre-war numbers. And that is a matter for praise to God. There is much grounds for thankfulness and expectation for the future. Who are the Covenanters? 50 minutes. All right, we're good. I hope that we've covered most of we've talked about triumph and tragedy and transition. And I want to just leave you with this thought. We are, of course, products of our history, all of us, okay? Church history, our family history, and so on. Our history is a story of these three T's: triumph, tragedy, and transition. Where do we end up? What is our identity? What is the RPCNA today? Well, I want to suggest that we are, if I can quote Ecclesiastes, a cord of three strands, and one which I trust cannot easily be broken. We have a covenantal heritage, and all that it involves, 4 centuries of testimony to the mediatorial kingship of Christ. We also have a Reformed theology, the 5 solas of the Reformation. We look back to the Westminster Standards and the values, and we value the corporate means of grace. But we also have an evangelical personal relationship with Jesus Christ in conversion, in personal godliness, in spiritual disciplines, and disciple making. And these 3 things come together to determine who we are. This is who we are as a denomination. We are a small tribe among the tribes of Israel. We have a glorious history. Certainly, it is a history marked by successes and failures. But above all, it is a history marked by the grace of God, that He has extended such kindness to us over so many centuries and generations. It moves us to pass that on to our children, so that perhaps 200 years from now, there will be somebody else up here telling the rest of the story of God's faith. And I don't know, Rich, how you want to, or Philip, whoever the MC is. Maybe we don't have time for questions, but
Thank you, David. I think a round of applause.
well, thank you.
History is full of lots of names and dates, and yet you've managed, David, to make it into a story of interest, and you've kept us all captive during that time. So thank you very much. But like a good speaker, you've managed to squeeze out any Q&A time. So if you do have questions, please speak to David over the break. We have about 30 minutes before our next lecture. So sorry that we can't do an open Q&A session. Would remind you there is the exhibition over here, so take a look at that. And if you like history that's recently been published about our congregation, you can purchase this for $25 in the corner in the library. If you are registered for the dinner tonight, that is included in the cost. To make sure you pick up a copy. Refreshments will be served downstairs, so please make your way downstairs to get some refreshments. And then we look forward to James Ferris speaking at 11 o'clock. Thank you, everyone.